"No one in this hall is brave enough to tell the truth," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath, yet it cut through the silence like moonlight through fog. The great stone chamber glowed with silver candles and the scent of pine resin, but Elara stood at the edge of it all as if she had been placed there by mistake. The wolves of Blackridge Pack wore polished velvet and jeweled pins, their laughter soft and sharp, their eyes moving over her worn dress, her lowered chin, her careful hands. Elara kept her fingers folded in front of her, because any tremble would be noticed, and any weakness would be remembered. She had learned that lesson young. In a place where strength was praised like a prayer, a quiet Omega like her was treated like an afterthought. Tonight was the moon feast, the one night each year when the entire pack gathered beneath the open rafters to honor the Alpha bloodline, and Elara had been ordered to serve the guests and stay invisible. She moved with a tray of cedar tea, her steps light on the cold stone, trying to become part of the shadows. But whispers followed her anyway. Too plain. Too soft. Too useless. The words drifted past her like smoke, and each one settled somewhere tender inside her chest. At the far end of the hall, beneath the carved wolf banners, Alpha Rowan sat in his high-backed chair, broad-shouldered and unreadable, his dark gaze fixed on the crowd as if he were listening to every heartbeat in the room. He was the kind of ruler people spoke about in careful voices, a man who had brought order to the Packlands and kept old rivalries from turning into open division. To most, he was a legend. To Elara, he was only the distant shape of power, untouchable and cold. She never expected him to look at her. She expected that even less when the laughter started. A younger wolf near the center table lifted his cup and pointed at her dress. "Did the servants run out of thread?" he asked, and several others chuckled. Heat rushed to Elara's face, but she did not answer. She could not afford to answer. She turned to leave, wanting only to reach the kitchen door and breathe in peace for one stolen minute. Then someone brushed past her shoulder too hard, and the tray tilted. One cup slipped from her hands, striking the stone floor with a clear, ringing crack. The tea spread in a dark amber pool at her feet. The hall went quiet in that cruel, expectant way that meant something worse was coming. "Careful," another voice said, amused and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us are trying to celebrate, not clean up after mistakes." A few wolves laughed again, and Elara stared at the spilled tea as if it might swallow her whole. Her throat burned. She bent quickly to gather the cup, because humiliation always felt easier when it was done fast. But before her fingers could touch the broken handle, a chair scraped across the floor. The sound was small, yet it changed everything. Elara looked up. Alpha Rowan had stood. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. He stepped down from the dais with slow, deliberate certainty, each footfall landing like a verdict. When he stopped in front of her, the laughter died completely. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not cold. They were watching her the way winter watches a small flame, as if he understood exactly how close she was to breaking. Elara's pulse stumbled. She did not know what frightened her more, the silence around them or the fact that for the first time all night, someone had truly seen her. Elara held still beneath Alpha Rowan's gaze, afraid that even a breath might shatter whatever strange mercy had settled over the room. The wolves around them stayed quiet, but quiet did not mean kind. She could feel their stares pressing into her back, feel the old shame rising again like a tide she had never learned to outrun. Her fingers curled around the broken teacup handle in her palm, the porcelain edge biting into her skin just enough to remind her she was still here, still standing. Rowan did not speak at once. He looked from her trembling hands to the spilled tea, then to the polished faces of the pack gathered on the dais. When he finally turned, the entire chamber seemed to move with him. Who asked for her to be made a servant in her own home? His voice was calm, but it carried farther than a shout. No one answered. One of the older wolves lowered his eyes. A woman near the front tightened her mouth and stared at the floorboards. Elara felt the room tilt, not from fear this time, but from the shock of being heard. She had expected mockery, perhaps indifference. Instead, the silence felt like a door opening somewhere deep inside her chest. Rowan reached for the dropped teacup, lifted it from the floor, and set it carefully aside as if the broken thing mattered. Then he looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted, small and unmistakable, as though patience had been replaced by a decision. "You will not kneel for spilled tea," he said. "And you will not be spoken to like this again." The words were simple, but they struck harder than any insult ever had, because they were offered without pity. Elara swallowed, her throat tight with disbelief. "I did not mean to cause trouble," she said, her voice thin and uncertain. It was the habit of a lifetime, to apologize before she was blamed. Rowan's jaw flexed once. "Then it is a good thing," he answered quietly, "that the trouble was never yours to begin with." A breath moved through the hall. Not a laugh. Not a sneer. Something softer, more dangerous to the old order than open cruelty had ever been. The wolves who had been watching her now watched him instead, as if they were only beginning to understand that the ground beneath them had changed. Elara felt it too, though she could not name it yet. The air had grown warmer. Less hostile. She stood very still, unsure whether she was allowed to believe what she had just heard. Rowan glanced toward the servants waiting near the side doors. "Fetch another cup," he said. "And bring her something warm to drink." The command was so ordinary that it nearly undid her. No one had ever ordered kindness on her behalf before. One servant hurried away at once. Elara lowered her eyes, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking. She hated that he could see it. She hated more that he did not look away. "Why are you doing this?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question slipped out raw and small, and for a moment even she regretted it. But Rowan only studied her with that same unreadable patience. "Because someone should have done it long before tonight," he said. There was no performance in him, no hunger for applause, no obvious desire to humiliate the people who had mocked her. That made him more unsettling than if he had simply spoken like a tyrant. Elara felt the weight of the moment gather around them, quiet and immense. She had lived too long in rooms where she was expected to disappear. Now, under the silver candlelight, with the whole pack listening, she could not disappear even if she tried. And for the first time, that did not feel like a punishment. It felt like the beginning of something she did not yet understand. The room did not recover after Rowan spoke. If anything, the silence only grew heavier, settling over the banquet hall like snow that had chosen to fall and never melt. Elara could feel it in every pair of eyes turned her way, in the way conversation had quietly died at every table, in the soft scrape of a chair someone moved but did not quite dare to stand from. She kept her shoulders straight, though her body felt strangely detached, as if she were watching herself from a distance and trying to decide whether this was real. Rowan still stood beside her, calm and immovable, one hand resting near the edge of the table as if he had all the time in the world. It was that stillness that unsettled her most. Men like the ones who had mocked her wore their cruelty openly. Rowan carried something else entirely. Control. Patience. A force that never needed to shout to be obeyed. Across the hall, one of the older wolves finally cleared his throat, but the sound came out thin and uncertain. "My lord," he began, and then stopped, as though the rest of the sentence had already betrayed him. Elara watched his gaze flick down to the broken teacup in her hand, then away again in embarrassment. Her fingers tightened around the handle. She was suddenly aware of how small she must look, standing there with her cheap dress, her lowered chin, and the faint tremor she could not quite hide. But Rowan did not look at her like she was small. He looked at her like she mattered. That thought was so startling that it almost made her unsteady. "You do not need to explain yourself to them," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the room. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Every wolf heard it. Elara swallowed. She had spent so many years being made to feel like an apology that she had forgotten what it was like to be spared one. The woman from the far table, the one who had laughed first, shifted in her seat and tried to smooth her expression into something more polite. Too late. The damage was already done. The shame in the room had changed direction, and now it belonged to the people who had tried to place it on her. Elara felt that shift before she fully understood it. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it moved through the hall all the same, like a door opening in a house that had been locked for years. Rowan reached for the empty chair beside her and pulled it back with quiet certainty. The gesture was simple. Almost ordinary. Yet it made several wolves lower their eyes. He wanted her seated. Not hidden. Not dismissed. Seen. Elara stared at the chair for one long second before slowly sitting, her pulse still beating too fast beneath her ribs. When she lowered herself into the seat, she felt the room change again, as if some old rule had cracked without warning. Rowan remained standing beside her, a sentinel in black and silver, his presence cutting a clear line between her and everyone who had expected her to shrink. "Eat," he said softly, sliding the untouched plate toward her. "You have been standing long enough." The words were simple, but they landed in her chest with an ache she could not name. No one had told her to do something so ordinary in what felt like years, not with kindness in it, not without an edge of mockery hidden beneath. Her throat tightened. She looked down at the plate, then at his hand, then away again because she did not trust herself to speak. The hall stayed quiet, watching. Waiting. And somewhere beneath the silence, deeper than fear and sharper than hope, Elara began to understand that the most dangerous thing in this room was not the pack that had laughed at her. It was the possibility that one act of mercy could change everything she thought she knew about herself. Elara did not realize she had started breathing again until the sound of silverware touching porcelain reached her ears. It was small, almost fragile, but in the stillness of the banquet hall it felt louder than any declaration. Someone at the far end of the room cleared his throat. Another shifted in his seat. No one spoke. No one dared to break what had already been broken. Rowan stayed beside her, calm and unmovable, his attention never leaving the room long enough to let it swallow her whole. The warmth of his presence did not erase the stares, but it gave them shape, and shape was easier to endure than endless dread. Elara kept her hands folded in her lap so they would not tremble. She could feel the weight of the untouched food in front of her, the faint steam curling from the plate, the scent of roasted herbs rising gently into the air. Ordinary things. Safe things. Yet she had not felt ordinary or safe in so long that both seemed almost unreal. At the next table, a woman lowered her eyes and pretended to focus on her own meal. It was not kindness, exactly, but it was not cruelty either. That alone felt like a doorway cracking open in a wall she had thought would never move. Rowan spoke without looking at her. "You do not have to earn a place at this table." The words were quiet. They were also impossible to misunderstand. Elara stared at him, her chest tightening around a feeling she could not yet name. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was fear. Mercy, she had learned, often came dressed as a trick. But this did not sound like a trick. It sounded like truth spoken by someone who had no need to soften it. One of the elders on the opposite side of the hall finally set his cup down with a careful little click. "Alpha Rowan," he said, his voice measured, too measured. "Perhaps we should continue the announcements." Rowan did not turn. Later. One word. No explanation. No apology. The elder went silent at once. Elara noticed then how everyone in the room responded to him the same way tall grass bends before wind. It cannot stop. Not from affection. Not always from fear. But from certainty. He was not loud. He did not need to be. The power in him moved beneath the silence like a river under ice, steady and undeniable. Her stomach tightened when the woman beside the elder glanced at her cloak, then at her hands, then quickly away again. Elara knew that look. She had worn it herself too many times to count. The look that measured worth, found little of it, and tried to pretend the judgment was not cruel. She lowered her gaze to the plate again. Her fingers hovered near the edge of the bread, hesitant as though even touching it might invite ridicule. But Rowan's voice, when it came again, was softer than before. "Eat, Elara." Hearing her name spoken like that nearly unraveled her. Not as a warning. Not as a mistake. Not as something to be corrected or endured. Simply as herself. She drew one careful breath and reached for the bread. The motion was small, but the room seemed to hold still around it, as if everyone had recognized the significance before she did. The first bite was dry, then warm, then unexpectedly comforting. It settled in her chest like proof that she was still here. Still present. Still human. Still worthy of a place in the world, no matter how many people had tried to convince her otherwise. Rowan watched her with an expression so restrained it was almost unreadable, yet there was something in his eyes that made her look away before she could understand it. Not pity. Never pity. Something deeper. Something careful. Something that looked dangerously close to respect. Across the hall, a few whispers began and then died just as quickly. Elara caught fragments. Questioning. Uneasy. Disbelief. The pack had expected a scene they could laugh at later, a small humiliation they could tuck away and repeat over drinks. Instead, they had been forced to witness something they did not know how to name, a woman they had dismissed being treated as though she mattered. The strange thing was, it did not make her feel powerful. It made her feel exposed. Like the ground beneath her old life had started to move, and there was no returning to the place where she had learned to disappear. Rowan lifted his cup, then set it down untouched. "Who was it?" he asked quietly, almost to no one. The question carried farther than his volume ever could. Several heads lifted. Elara did not at first understand. Then she did. Who had left her waiting? Who had thought it acceptable? Who had believed she would accept being forgotten? The room stiffened. Someone swallowed hard. Elara turned her head just enough to glance at him, and for the first time that evening, she saw not only the alpha standing before the pack, but the man beneath the title, the one who seemed willing to pause the whole world if it meant she did not have to keep hurting in silence. Her heart gave a painful, uncertain turn. She did not know what frightened her more, the attention now fixed on her, or the possibility that she might no longer be able to hide inside it. The room remained frozen around them, but Elara could feel the change in the air as if the banquet hall itself had drawn a sharp breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. Alpha Rowan had asked a question no one in the pack had ever been brave enough to ask on her behalf, and that simple thing unsettled her more than the mockery ever had. Her fingers curled against the edge of her sleeve, still damp from the spilled drink that had marked her like an afterthought minutes before. She should have felt embarrassed. She should have felt small. Instead, standing beside him, she felt something stranger, something fragile and dangerous, like the first warmth after a winter storm. Across the table, a woman in a jeweled collar looked down at her plate as if the answer might appear there. A man near the hearth shifted hard enough for his fork to scrape porcelain. No one volunteered a name. No one met Rowan's eyes for long. Elara understood then that silence was its own kind of confession. They had all seen what happened. They had all chosen to let it happen. And now they were trapped inside the shame of it, unable to pretend otherwise. Rowan's hand moved, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the steady force of him beside her, like a wall built against the rest of the room. Was it an accident, he asked, his tone quiet, almost patient, and that was somehow worse than anger. Because patience meant he expected an answer. It meant he intended to hear one. A few heads turned toward the woman who had laughed the loudest. Her face drained of color. Elara watched her lips part, then close again. The woman's eyes flicked to Elara, then away, and in that tiny movement Elara saw everything she had known for years, the ranking, the cruelty, the ease with which people decided whose discomfort mattered and whose did not. Yet Rowan did not move on. He did not let the moment slip away. He held it there, suspended, until the whole room was forced to sit inside it with her. That was when Alara realized something she had never dared to imagine before. This was not only about defending her. It was about making the pack look directly at the truth they had trained themselves to ignore. Her throat tightened. It would have been easier to stay invisible. Easier to let this fade into another story told at her expense. But standing in the center of every eye in the room, she could feel the old version of herself loosening, like a knot finally giving way after years of being pulled too tight. She did not know what kind of courage it took to be seen this way. She only knew it made her chest ache. At last, the woman at the table gave a stiff, frightened laugh that landed badly in the silence. "It was only a misunderstanding," she said, her voice too quick, too thin. The excuse sounded weak before it even finished. Alara looked at Rowan then, truly looked at him, and found no hint of amusement in his face, no smug satisfaction, no desire to humiliate anyone in return. His expression was steady, almost unreadable, but the set of his jaw told her enough. He was not asking for a performance. He was asking for truth. The realization settled over her slowly, almost painfully, because truth had never been something anyone offered her before. It had always been used against her, twisted into accusation, into gossip, into another reason she should lower her eyes and say nothing. But now, with the pack holding its breath around her, truth had become something else. Something weighty. Something that could change the shape of a room. Alara swallowed, and the motion felt loud in the silence. She could feel the tremor in her hands, but she did not step back. For once, she let the stillness hold her instead of swallowing her whole. Rowan turned his head just enough to look down at her, and she caught a brief flicker in his eyes, not pity, never pity, but a hard, protective patience that made her want to believe in him even as fear tugged at her from every side. "Tell me who did this," he said softly. "And do not lie to me." The words were not sharp, yet they landed with the force of a command. Ilara's pulse stumbled. Somewhere beyond the long banquet table, someone stood too fast, a chair scraping against the floor. A second later, another voice tried to speak over it, then stopped. The room had gone from mocking her to fearing what she might say. She should have been frightened by that. Instead, Alara felt the smallest, strangest lift in her chest. For the first time in her life, the room was not asking her to disappear. It was waiting for her to speak. And because Rowan was standing there beside her, looking at her as if her words mattered, Alara drew in a careful breath and finally found the strength to answer. Ilara's voice trembled at first, thin as thread, but it did not break. Under the weight of every gaze in the hall, she told the truth in a way she had never dared to before. The servant who had spilled the wine had not tripped. The cup had not slipped from clumsy hands. Someone had wanted her humiliated, wanted the stain on her dress to become the last thing everyone saw when they looked at her. The words left her mouth in careful pieces, each one drawn from a place she had kept locked away for years, and with every sentence, the room grew quieter. Rowan did not interrupt her. He stood beside her with one hand resting near the small of her back, not touching, only there, a steady presence that made it easier to keep going. Alara felt the strange burn of being heard. It was almost too much. The pack had trained her to expect laughter, to expect dismissal, to expect that anything she said would be bent until it sounded foolish. But no one was laughing now. Across the table, one of the elders lowered his gaze. Another looked suddenly interested in his cup, as if the polished silver might save him from the shame gathering in the room. Alara swallowed, her throat tight, and forced herself to finish. When she named the woman who had ordered the insult, a murmur moved through the banquet hall like wind through dry grass. Not outrage yet. Not quite. More like shock, sharp and uncertain, because the truth had arrived in a place that had been built to bury it. Rowan's jaw tightened, though his expression remained controlled. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice low and even. The question was not for Alara. It was for the pack. For the people who had looked away when she was hurt. For the ones who had smiled too quickly when she bent her head. Alara's fingers eased from a hard curl into a trembling open hand. She had expected this moment to feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. Instead, it felt like stepping into cold water and finding that she could still breathe. Around them, chairs shifted. A few wolves avoided Rowan's eyes. One woman in a dark emerald gown pressed her lips together so tightly that the color drained from them. Elara recognized the look in her face. Not guilt. Fear of being seen. That, more than anything, made her stomach turn. It had always been easier for them to punish the quiet girl than to face what they had done. But now they were being asked to face it. Rowan turned slightly toward the accused woman, and the entire hall seemed to draw inward with him. "Did you think," he said, each word measured, "that I would stand here and allow cruelty to be dressed up as tradition?" No one answered. The silence was answer enough. Elara felt the heat climb behind her eyes, not from shame this time, but from the terrifying relief of being believed. She had spent so long shrinking herself to survive that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be met with steadiness instead of scorn. Rowan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You will apologize," he said. "And then you will explain yourself before this table." The command landed like a bell struck once in an empty room. The woman's face turned pale. The elder beside her looked as though he might object, but one glance from Rowan silenced him. Elara stared at the scene unfolding before her, her pulse thudding hard enough to hurt. This was not what she had known. In her life, those with power used it to step over her, to make her smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. But Rowan was using his to do something she had never seen anyone do for her. He was making space where there had only ever been pressure. And though fear still lived inside her, it no longer stood alone. Something else had entered the room with him, something fierce and guarded and impossibly gentle. It told her that this moment was not the end of her humiliation. It was the beginning of its undoing. The woman at the center of the accusation finally lowered her head. Her voice, when it came, was stiff with resistance. "I meant no harm." The excuse was so weak that even the nearest wolves seemed to flinch at it. Elara did not look at her. She could not. Her attention remained on Rowan, on the way he waited with a kind of patience that felt almost more powerful than anger. He had not rescued her by speaking over her. He had asked her to speak, and then he had made sure the room listened. That difference settled into her chest like a spark in dry wood. For the first time, she understood that being protected did not always look like being hidden. Sometimes it looked like being seen, fully and without mercy for the lies others told about you. And as the truth spread across the hall, slow and unavoidable, Elara lifted her chin a fraction higher than she ever had before. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, stretched tight with every pair of eyes in the banquet hall fixed on Elara as if the room had only just learned her name. Her hands still trembled at her sides, but she kept her chin lifted, because Rowan had not asked her to shrink. He had asked her to stand. And now, with the truth hanging between them, she felt something inside her begin to shift, slow and uncertain, like a door opening in a house that had been locked for years. The woman who had been accused stood rigid near the table, her face pale beneath the golden lights. No one rushed to comfort her. No one laughed now either. That was what stunned Elara the most. The same wolves who had looked through her moments ago were looking at her differently now, as if the world had quietly changed shape and they had not noticed until it was too late. Rowan remained beside her, steady as stone, his presence so calm it made the entire hall feel louder by contrast. He did not speak over her. He did not take the truth from her mouth and make it his own. He only watched the room with a patience that felt more commanding than fury. Elara had never known silence could feel like shelter. Usually it came to her as punishment, as the space after someone dismissed her, as the heavy pause before another cruel remark. But this silence was different. This one made room. It wrapped around her shaking breath and held it in place until she no longer felt as though she might break under the weight of being seen. Somewhere beyond the long table, a goblet was set down with a soft, careful sound. Someone had stopped pretending to eat. Someone else lowered their gaze. The shift moved through the hall in waves, subtle but undeniable. Elara could feel it in the air, in the way the torchlight seemed warmer now, in the way her own pulse no longer thudded only with fear. It still hurt to stand here. It still hurt to remember how quickly a room could turn against her. But beneath that hurt was something else, something fragile and dangerous and almost unfamiliar. Hope did not arrive all at once. It came like this, one breath at a time, one small refusal to bow lower than before. Elara looked at the woman who had tried to shame her and saw, for the first time, not power, but desperation. Not strength, but the panic of someone caught in her own lie. That realization should have softened the moment. Instead, it sharpened it. Because Elara understood now that humiliation had always depended on silence. It lived in the things she had swallowed, in the words she had been too afraid to speak, in the way others had mistaken her quiet for weakness. Tonight, that pattern was breaking. Not loudly. Not all at once. But breaking, little by little, under the simple, impossible fact that she had told the truth and the room had not swallowed her for it. Rowan turned his head a fraction, just enough for her to catch the glint of his profile. His expression did not ask her to be brave. It told her she already was. That look landed deeper than any praise ever could. Elara drew in a slow breath and, for the first time, let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the shame. Not just the fear. Also the release. Also the strange trembling relief of no longer carrying the lie alone. And in that narrow space between pain and peace, she understood that this was not the end of being hurt. Life would not become gentle simply because one truth had been spoken aloud. But something had changed, something irrevocable and bright. The room had seen her. Not as a mistake. Not as a burden. As a voice. As someone whose truth mattered. That was enough to make her knees unsteady. That was enough to make her want to cry and stand taller at the same time. The woman near the table finally let out a shallow breath, and Elara realized the entire hall had been waiting for Rowan to speak again. But he did not rush to fill the space. He let the weight of Elara's words remain where they belonged. He let the room feel them. And because he did, because he understood that her dignity could not be handed to her like a favor, Elara felt it returning in pieces she could finally hold. A small fire had started in her chest, quiet but real. It was not anger, though anger had lived there for years. It was something cleaner. Something steadier. The knowledge that she had survived being watched and had not disappeared under the gaze. The knowledge that she had spoken and had been heard. She did not know what would come next. She only knew that when she lifted her eyes now, she no longer saw herself the way they had forced her to see herself for so long. And for the first time in far too many years, that felt like the beginning of a life. Rowan did not move at once. He stood beside Elara as if he understood that the next moment belonged to her alone, and that any rush to rescue the silence would only break something fragile that had finally begun to mend. The banquet hall still felt held in suspense, every candle flame wavering softly above polished glass and white linen, every face turned toward the girl who had once been dismissed before she even had the chance to speak. Elara could feel the weight of those gazes, but they no longer crushed her the way they had only minutes before. They pressed against her skin like winter air at an open window, sharp and cold, yet strangely cleansing too. The truth was no longer hidden beneath trembling hands and lowered eyes. It was here, breathing in the room with her. Across the hall, one of the elders lowered his fork and stared as if he were seeing her for the first time. Another woman, who had smiled with thin cruelty not long ago, looked away first. Elara noticed. She noticed all of it. And for the first time, noticing did not make her want to disappear. It made her feel awake. Rowan's presence at her side was steady, but he did not crowd her. He gave her space to own what she had just done. That, more than anything, kept her standing. She had spent so many years learning how to make herself smaller so others would not be annoyed by her existence, so many years folding her voice into silence before anyone could tear it apart. But now the room had hurt her, and nothing could put that back into the dark. Her fingers loosened little by little. Her shoulders, still tense, began to settle. There was no triumph in her posture, only something quieter and far more powerful. Relief. The kind that came after a storm when the body still remembered fear but the heart had begun to believe in shelter. Rowan finally turned his head toward her, just slightly, and she saw in his eyes the same unspoken truth he had offered her before. He was not asking her to perform. He was not asking her to prove herself any further. He was simply waiting. The corner of Alara's mouth trembled as she looked back at him, and though she did not smile fully, something almost like one softened her face. It was small, but it was real. A few breaths passed. Then another. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the cruel silence of judgment. It had become the kind of silence that follows recognition, when even the harshest people are forced to sit with what they have seen and cannot unsee. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a glass was set down with a careful touch. The soft sound seemed to travel through the room like a ripple across still water. Alara lifted her chin a little higher. Not in defiance. Not yet. More like a woman learning the shape of her own worth and testing whether she was finally allowed to hold it. The heat under her ribs was faint, but it did not fade. It grew. A slow, steady warmth that no one in this room had given her before. Not the kind that rushed and burned, but the kind that stayed. The kind that told her she was no longer standing in the shadow of other people's opinions. Rowan's voice, when it came, was low and even. You did well. The words were simple. They did not sound like praise meant to be admired by the room. They sounded like truth. Alara blinked once, and the ache that followed was almost embarrassing in its tenderness. No one had ever said something like that to her in front of others and meant it without condition. She swallowed carefully, then looked ahead again as if she were still learning how to meet the world with open eyes. The hall waited with her. Not for her to shrink. Not for her to fail. For her to decide what kind of woman she would be from this moment on. And inside that waiting, Alara felt the first clear edge of a future she had never been brave enough to imagine. The first signs of dawn had only just touched the banquet hall windows when Alara realized no one was looking at her with dismissal anymore. They were looking at her with the uneasy stillness people wore when they had mistaken someone's worth and could not undo the mistake quickly enough. The air still held the soft brightness of candlelight, but something in the room had changed for good. Alara stood very still, her hands folded lightly before her, as if she were learning how to occupy space without apology. It was a small posture, almost invisible, yet for her it felt like standing at the edge of a new world. Rowan remained beside her, close enough that his presence steadied her, but never so close that it felt like he was speaking for her. That mattered more than she could have explained. He had not stepped in to erase her voice. He had simply made room for it to exist. Across the hall, one of the elders lowered her gaze. Another pressed a hand to her mouth, not in mockery now, but in shame. The woman who had spoken so sharply before looked suddenly older, the harshness leaving her face like winter thawing into bare ground. Alara had expected anger. She had prepared herself for more disbelief, more whispers, more careful cruelty wrapped in polite words. Instead, what she found was silence. Heavy, thoughtful silence. It did not heal everything. It did not return what had been taken from her or erase the years she had spent being made small. But it did something she had not expected. It left room for the truth to breathe. And in that breath, she felt her own shoulders loosen. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough to know she was no longer bracing for the next wound. Rowan turned his head slightly, his voice low so only she could hear. You do not need to prove anything else tonight. Alara let the words settle into her like warm light. A part of her wanted to argue, to say she had spent too long proving things for people who never intended to believe her. But the truth was, she was tired of defending the shape of her own life. She looked ahead at the watching hall and found, to her surprise, that she was not afraid of them anymore. Not because they had become kind. Not because everything had been forgiven. But because she had survived being unseen, and now she had survived being heard. That was a different kind of strength. A quieter one. A truer one. A servant moved near the far table, setting down a tray with careful hands, and the small clink of glass sounded almost sacred in the stillness. Someone in the back cleared his throat. Another bowed his head. The room, which had once seemed built entirely to measure Elara's shame, now seemed unable to hold it. She drew in one slow breath and felt the cool air sharpen her thoughts. There was a future beyond this hall. She could sense it the way a person senses sunrise before the sky fully changes, subtle but certain. It would not be easy. People who had believed lies for years did not become wise in a single evening. Wounds did not vanish because truth had finally spoken. But something had begun. A correction. A reckoning. And for the first time, Elara did not feel like the one standing at the mercy of everyone else's judgment. She felt, instead, like someone who had been quietly returned to herself. Rowan looked at her then, not with triumph, but with a kind of steady respect that made her chest ache in the most tender way. He was waiting, not commanding. Waiting for her to decide what came next. Elara glanced once toward the open doors where dawn was brightening the edges of the world, and she understood that this was not the end of her story. It was the first chapter she would ever be allowed to write with her own hands. And for the first time in a life measured by silence, that thought did not frighten her. It lifted her. By the time the hall began to empty, Elara no longer felt the need to fold herself small. The evening had changed her, not all at once, but in a way that settled deep beneath her skin and stayed there. She could still feel the old instinct, the one that had taught her to lower her eyes, to soften her voice, to make herself easy to overlook. But it had grown weaker now, like a door left open too long to winter air. Around her, servants moved carefully between the tables, collecting untouched dishes and setting down fresh water with hands that no longer trembled quite so much. Even they seemed to sense that something important had shifted, though no one would have been able to name it aloud. Rowan remained close, not crowding her, not speaking for her, only standing there with the quiet patience of someone who knew that trust could not be rushed. When Elara finally turned toward him, he met her gaze without hesitation, as if he had never once doubted she would find her footing if given the chance. That steadiness undid her in ways praise never could. It made her throat tighten and her eyes sting, because it asked nothing of her except honesty. Outside, the first true light of morning had begun to spread beyond the windows, washing the edges of the banquet hall in pale gold. It was the kind of light that made everything look clearer, and with clarity came discomfort. Faces that had been sharp with judgment only hours ago were now careful, uncertain, almost reverent in their silence. Elara did not mistake that for forgiveness. She knew better than to expect a single night to erase every cruel word spoken over her life. Some people would carry their shame quietly. Others would try to hide it behind politeness. A few would never admit they had been wrong at all. But that no longer had the power to define her. She felt it in the way she stood, in the way she breathed, in the way her own name no longer sounded like something borrowed. When she glanced toward the open doors, the daylight beyond them seemed to call her forward with gentle insistence. It was not a command. It was an invitation. And for the first time, Elara understood that a future did not have to arrive fully formed to be real. It could begin as simply as this, one clear morning, one honest choice, one small refusal to disappear again. She looked back at Rowan, and in his eyes she saw no demand, only respect so steady it almost felt like shelter. The kind of respect that did not ask her to prove her worth. The kind that already recognized it. Her breath eased. Something inside her, long held in silence, finally loosened. Not all the way. Not enough to make her careless, but enough to let hope Indiana. And hope, she was learning, could be its own kind of courage. The morning after the banquet did not feel triumphant. It felt careful, like the first step after crossing ice that had nearly cracked beneath her. Elara moved through the castle corridors with a quieter kind of steadiness than she had ever known, her hands folded at her waist, her chin lifted just enough to keep from looking timid. Servants who once passed her with distracted eyes now stepped aside with visible hesitation, uncertain of the woman they were seeing. That uncertainty no longer frightened her. It only reminded her how quickly the world could change when it realized it had misjudged someone for too long. Rowan walked beside her at an unhurried pace, not crowding her, not steering her, simply staying near in a way that felt more powerful than any command. At a turn in the corridor, he stopped before a tall window and looked out over the grounds where the winter grass had begun to show through the frost. "There is something you should see," he said softly. He did not explain further, and Elara did not ask. She had learned that some moments revealed themselves best when they were not rushed. They crossed into a quieter wing of the castle, one she had never been invited to enter before. The hall there was smaller, warmer, lined with shelves, maps, and old records tied in faded ribbon. It smelled faintly of paper, cedar, and clean stone. Elara slowed at the doorway, unsure why her chest had tightened. On a long table in the center of the room lay several documents, a folded cloth seal, and a ledger open to a page marked with Rowan's hand. He watched her face carefully as she approached, and for the first time since she had known him, his expression held a trace of something like concern. "You deserve the full truth," he said. "Not pieces of it. Not the version people used to keep you small." Elara looked down at the papers. They were older than she expected, their edges worn smooth by time, their marks neat and official. She did not understand everything at first, but she understood enough. Names. Boundaries. Rights. The kind of things that decided whether a person belonged to themselves or belonged to everyone else by default. A slow ache rose in her throat. For years, she had been told she asked for too much whenever she asked for respect. Now she was staring at proof that she had been denied what should have been hers from the beginning. Her fingers hovered over the page, then settled on it gently, as if the truth might vanish if she touched it too hard. "This is about the house," she whispered. Rowan nodded once. "And about the agreement that was used to keep it out of your hands." The words landed with a quiet weight, not cruel, only final. Elara read the line again. Then again. With each pass, something inside her shifted from hurt to understanding. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. And understanding, she was beginning to see, could be the first form of power. Rowan waited until she had taken in enough to breathe again. Then he said, "I brought you here because I will not build anything with you on an incomplete foundation." That made her look up. The sincerity in his eyes did not ask her to trust blindly. It invited her to trust carefully. It gave her room to think. To doubt. To choose. Elara let out a slow breath and placed both palms on the table's edge, grounding herself in its solid wood. The old fear that she would be cornered, handled, decided for, did not disappear all at once. But it loosened. In its place came something steadier. A need to know more. A need to claim her own history instead of letting others narrate it for her. "Then tell me everything," she said, and the strength in her voice surprised even her. Rowan did not smile, not yet. He only inclined his head as if she had just done something he had been waiting for all along. "I will," he answered. "And when this is done, nothing about your life will be decided without you." The promise settled between them like a candle lit in a dark room. Small, but impossible to ignore. Elara looked again at the papers, at the careful lines and old signatures, and felt the shape of a future begin to form around the edges of her fear. It was not a future without struggle. She knew that now. It was a future where struggle did not mean surrender. One where her voice would matter, not because someone powerful allowed it, but because it had always mattered. In the stillness of that room, with morning light gathering across the table, Elara realized that healing was not always a sudden thing. Sometimes it began as a choice to stop looking away. And for the first time, she was ready to look directly at the life that had been waiting for her all along. By midday, the castle no longer felt like a place built to keep Elara out. It still held its long shadows and polished stone, but something in the air had changed, something quiet and stubborn, like spring pushing through frozen ground. She stood in the archive room with Rowan beside her, the scent of old paper and cedar drifting through the open window, while a steward delivered the first of the corrected records to the table. Names that had been altered. Disputes that had been buried. Allowances that had vanished without explanation. Elara looked down at the pages and felt a strange ache settle in her chest. Not pain, this time. Recognition. For so long, she had been taught to believe that confusion was her fault, that silence meant weakness, that if she could not prove what had been done to her then it must not have mattered. Now, line by line, the truth stood in front of her in careful ink. Rowan did not rush her. He waited while she read, one page at a time, his presence steady at her shoulder, not pressing, only anchoring. When she finally exhaled, it was with more strength than fear. "This will help the others too," she said softly, her finger resting on the edge of the page. "It will," Rowan answered. "And they will hear it from you, not through anyone else." The words made her look up. There was no command in his face, no demand for performance, only trust. It was a kind of faith Elara had never been given before, and because of that, it touched her more deeply than praise ever could. By afternoon, the first messages had gone out to the women and families the court had overlooked for years. Small repairs were being approved. Old grievances were being reviewed. It was not a miracle. It was something more lasting than that. It was work. Honest, patient work. Elara moved through it carefully, answering questions, writing names, listening to voices that had been ignored for far too long. And with every answer she gave, something in her grew steadier. Not louder. Not harder. Just steadier. By evening, when the light turned soft and gold against the windows, one of the younger servants approached her with a folded ribbon and a shy smile. "For your hair, my lady," the girl said, as if the title still surprised her. Elara took it with both hands. Her throat tightened. It was such a small gift, almost nothing at all, yet it felt like a door opening in a place she had long believed was sealed shut. She thanked the girl gently, and when the servant hurried away, Elara sat for a moment in silence, the ribbon resting against her palm. Then Rowan came to stand beside her again, and this time he did not look at the papers. He looked at her. "You are carrying this better than you think," he said. Elara gave a small, uncertain smile. "I am still afraid." "Good," he replied, and the corners of his mouth softened. "Fear means you know this matters." His voice did not try to remove the fear. It only made room for it. That, more than anything, is what let her breathe. She looked out through the window at the courtyard below, where lanterns were beginning to glow one by one as the sky deepened. For the first time, the castle lights did not seem far away from her. They seemed to be waiting with her. And in that quiet, with the day settling into evening and the future no longer feeling like a locked door, Elara understood that healing was not finished because one truth had been spoken. It was only beginning, and she was no longer facing it alone. By the time the last lanterns were lit across the courtyard, the castle no longer felt like a place that held its breath around Elara. It felt awake. It felt changed. Soft light spilled over the stone paths and brushed the tall windows, turning the old walls gold at the edges, as if even the palace itself had decided to remember gentleness. Elara stood near the archway leading to the garden, one hand resting lightly against the cool stone, listening to the quiet rise and fall of evening around her. There was no ceremony now. No one was watching to measure her worth. And somehow, that was what made the moment feel sacred. Rowan came to stand beside her without a word. His presence was steady, warm, familiar in a way that no title could ever explain. For a while, they simply looked out at the gardens below, where the first stars had begun to gather above the darkening trees. "It is strange," Elara said at last, her voice soft but clear. "I used to think peace would feel like an ending." Rowan glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting with quiet understanding. "And now?" She let her fingers curl against the stone, feeling its solid weight beneath her hand. "Now it feels like a beginning." The words settled between them, gentle as falling snow. Elara thought of all the days when she had made herself smaller to survive, of every silent room, every lowered gaze, every moment she had believed she was asking for too much simply by existing. None of it had prepared her for this. Not for being seen. Not for being trusted. Not for being loved without condition. She turned toward the garden, where the path of lantern light stretched into the roses and the sleeping hedges beyond. Her reflection in the glass of the nearest window caught her eye, and for the first time, she did not look away. The woman staring back was still soft around the edges, still marked by everything she had lived through, but she was no longer hidden inside her own life. She belonged to it now. And it belonged to her. Behind her, the doors of the archive room stood open, waiting for tomorrow and the work that would continue there. The records still needed restoring. The wrongs still needed mending. The castle would not become kind overnight. But that no longer frightened her. She had learned that healing was not a single moment, and justice was not a single speech. Both were built slowly, with patience, with truth, with hands that stayed when it was easier to leave. Rowan reached for her then, not to claim, not to command, but simply to offer. Elara placed her hand in his, and the simple act of trust felt like a promise larger than any crown. Together, they stepped out into the garden where the air was cool and sweet with night-blooming flowers. The moon hung above them, pale and patient, as if it had been waiting all along to bless what had finally come right. Elara looked up at it and felt no fear, only a deep and steady calm. Her story had not ended when the world first opened its eyes to her. It had only changed shape. It had become something stronger than sorrow, softer than power, and brighter than silence. It had become a life she could live openly, a future she could shape with her own hands, and a love that did not ask her to disappear in order to deserve it. In the quiet beneath the stars, Elara understood at last that destiny was never meant to make her small. It had been waiting to make room for her all along.